Okay, this video is the follow-up, the part 2 of this one here. The stewards being grossly unfit for purpose for the decision making that they made at the 2025 Italian Grand Prix. Now at that Grand Prix they determined that Kimi Antonelli was guilty. They referred to it as erratic driving. It was crowding Alex Albon off the track. They determined that Esteban Ocon was guilty of crowding Lance Stroll off the track. They awarded both of those drivers a 5-second penalty and 1 point on their super license. The reality is, those situations are dangerous when you crowd a fellow competitor off the track, making them have to leave the track to avoid a collision. That is a significant danger. Okay, that's a dangerous situation. You've made them have to take evasive action. You've pushed them onto an area of much lower grip, and therefore that creates danger. The element of danger would mean that the minimum penalty of just 5 seconds does not apply. It should be at least 10 seconds for that conduct. They didn't penalise Carlos Sainz for failing to follow the race director's instructions about using the little runoff area created and the manner in which you have to return to the track once you leave the track at turn 4, the turn 4-5 chicane. And they penalised Ollie Bearman incorrectly when Carlos Sainz was at fault for the collision between the two drivers later on in that race, awarding Bearman a 10-second penalty and 2 super licence points. That's all evidenced in that video, along with other things. In this video, we're going to go through the footage on the Sky Sports F1 highlights video that they've got on their YouTube channel and look at the other infringements that took place in that event that the stewards didn't even look at. Infringements that drivers perpetrated that they did not receive an appropriate penalty for that should have impacted their race. Now, when a driver receives a penalty, that impacts their race relative to everybody in that race. If two drivers are essentially squabbling in a race and one commits a foul against the other and then the other commits a foul against that driver in return, they don't just cancel each other out. You get penalised for your infringement. That penalty impacts your race relative to everybody else in that race. You lose 10 seconds to everybody because you've committed a driving offence. So this is how it should be. You commit a driving offence, you get penalised for it. That impacts your race. And how that impacts you relative to everybody else is how it does. So what we're now going to do is go through the actual footage that's on the Sky Sports highlights program and go through the infringements that those stewards didn't even look at. The first of which is directly from the start of the race, where Max Verstappen crowds Lando Norris off the track in, if not, it's actually a worse way than what Ocon and Antonelli did. In Ocon's case, where he crowds Lance Stroll off the road, he is trying to widen his line out to take more speed through a corner, defend his position, and sweep as wide as possible over to the right-hand side of the track so he can carry more speed into the corner. That is what Ocon was attempting to do. He was wrong in doing so because he didn't leave his fellow competitor track room. But at least you could say that that was a mitigating circumstance. In Antonelli's case, he was at a section of the track which was a slight curve, but it's a curve that they accelerate around, and the manner in which the cars sweep generally is akin to the way that Antonelli was driving from the angle that we were seeing. But he still forced Albon off the track. Didn't leave a car that was there, that was entitled to track room, didn't leave it room. Okay, Max Verstappen, on the other hand, is going straight down a straight to a corner that the racing line is the wide line to that corner, where you stay left and then sweep over to the apex of the corner. Going down that straight, where you can travel in a straight line, Max runs the other driver out of track room. That's a bullying manoeuvre. That's disgusting. Let's play it through. So you can see from the start that Lando Norris gets a better start. he gets off the line better than Max, and you can see him closing. You can see the front wheels on Lando's car gradually getting ahead of Max's car, and they're now alongside. When you are part of your car is alongside the car that you're challenging, you've got to be left track room on that racetrack. For example here, if you are Oscar Piastri in third position and you've got a car behind you, you are within your rights to move across to block that car off. However, the Ferrari in of fourth place of Charles Leclerc can then move to this side of the track to make an overtaking manoeuvre, and what Oscar's then not allowed to do is move all the way across here to block him over here as well. If Oscar moves back to try and keep him out wide, then he has to leave at least a car's width on this side of the track. Here, between Max and Lando, Lando has got himself alongside, partially alongside this car here. So Max has to respect that and leave him track room. At least a car's width, but you need to leave yourself a safety margin. What we see here, this white line that I'm trying to wave my cursor over, is the track limit. Along with this one, that's the track in between these two lines. These two lines merging into the track is the pit lane merging into the track, and the dotted line you can see is the threshold between the pit lane and the actual track. And as we go down here, you'll see that when you come out of the pits, you still have to stay within that white line, the designated pit lane still, whilst you get up to speed before you go on to the actual racetrack. Otherwise, you come out onto that live racetrack, haven't accelerated up to speed, and you create a danger. That's why they have the pit lane extending onto the actual track itself. But the actual track is to the left of this dotted line. Everything to the right of it, you're off the track. Now, the kiddies have been conditioned to the notion that you are still technically classed as being on the track if just your, in the case of Norris here, just your left-hand tyres are still in contact with the white line, you're still on the track. Now, in terms of setting a lap time, that criteria meets the FIA criteria for it still qualifying as a valid lap time. Likewise, if you are attempting an overtaking manoeuvre around and outside and you have that much of your car just touching the white line, then they deem that valid. The reality is the right hand side of Lando's car isn't on the track. Okay, but his front right tyre is off the track. It's outside the white line, it's off the track. It should be fully on the track. Lando is leaving room. He shouldn't have to, but he's up against Max Verstappen, and all of the drivers know that you have to make sure you keep away from this guy, because otherwise he will collide with you. If you don't move, he will run into you. He's demonstrated that throughout his career. And what is taking place? Lando is trying to leave a gap. He shouldn't have to. Look, at over half of his car is not on that racetrack. The racetrack is determined by this white line and this white line and what is in between. If you are outside of that white line, that part of your car is off the track. You have to be left a full car's width on the track. And what is Max doing? Max takes it to there. Lando is more than halfway alongside him. Max has run him off the track. There are no mitigating circumstances. That's an aggressive manoeuvre, a bullying manoeuvre to run the other driver off the track, to prevent him from attacking you. That is a disgusting manoeuvre. It's a dangerous manoeuvre. It's a minimum of a 10-second penalty because it's dangerous, therefore 10-second penalty. But there are no mitigating circumstances. He's not having to take evasive action to avoid anybody else. He's not trying to line himself up for the corner to take the racing line through the corner or as close to that as possible. He is purposefully trying to impede the other driver to prevent the other driver from making an overtaking manoeuvre on him, ruining the other guy's chances in that race. That is a minimum of a 10-second penalty. So, we'll play this on forward and we'll focus initially on what takes place between Lando and Max before coming back and looking at the other incidents that are taking place down this start-finish straight. 150 metres, we would need, and what we don't get from the show of Formula One, is a graphical overlay on the footage, which could easily be done, which would demonstrate to the viewer where the braking zone to this corner should be. Now, we can appreciate that all drivers will have their own braking zone. They'll have their own point in time where they put their foot on the brakes. But using the telemetry and taking a solid average, you can display to people the parameters for the braking zone and the zone in which we assess the relative locations of these cars to one another to assess who is entitled to the lines around corners to determine that. It's easily done. The show doesn't do that. Rather than solve any problems, they would rather incite the conflict and allow the arguments to happen. That is what they purposefully do. They purposefully want that conflict because that engagement, people arguing, makes them money, makes the show more marketable to the sponsors that want engagement, want eyes on the brand. So, where is the braking zone? Difficult to say. We could hear sometimes, if we've got the audio on, the onboards, we can hear when the drivers are coming off the throttle and down changing. We're now out from the 50-metre board to be afforded track room around the corner. The attacking car, the car that's behind, which in this case is Lando Norris, has to be at least halfway alongside the car he's trying to overtake at the braking zone in order to be afforded track room. Okay? In order to be afforded track room, so that the other car doesn't just simply cut him off. The car, if Oscar here is trying to attack Max on the outside at the braking zone, Oscar would have to be at least fully alongside him. At least fully alongside him to be afforded track room on exit of the corner. So let's suggest that Lando is in a position where he has earned the right to track room going around this corner. Meaning, a car's width going around this corner has to be left for Lando. Max has to be on his outside of that. And on exit over here, when you exit the corner, Lando has to leave a car's width on his outside for Max. So going around here, has Max left Lando a car's width? Well, that's not a full car's width, but this is a reasonable position for Lando to be in. We do know that when there is curbing there, drivers often use that curbing to go round a corner. Both cars negotiated it around there safely without any dramas. There was no contact. That would be one where, despite not a full car width being left, the steward would look at that and say that would be acceptable under normal racing conditions. There was no harm caused to either car, and that would be deemed fine. Okay, the drivers, relative to one another, were able to negotiate that corner safely at that point. But has Lando carried in so much extra speed that he's able to keep control of his car and take a line that's going to leave Max room on exit of this corner? No, he hasn't. Lando's speed on entry has taken him to this position on exit, meaning he has ran Max out of track room at this point in time here. There is not the room for Max to be on the track. Lando is guilty of forcing Max off the track. That is dangerous. Had Max attempted to be on there, there would be a collision. So here, Lando Norris has committed an infringement. That is a dangerous infringement. That constitutes a 10-second penalty. Not the minimum 5, which can only be awarded when there is no danger involved. When there's danger involved, it's a minimum of 10. 10-second penalty for Lando Norris. Now, are there any mitigating circumstances? Mitigating circumstances are such that Lando was the victim of Max's aggression in the first instance. When you are the victim of such an injustice, then that does impact your behaviour. We can all claim that we should be saintly and not react to that, but the reality is people do. When you've suffered an injustice, that lights a fire inside some people and makes you more willing to engage in a kind of battle and overstep the limit, which is what he's done there. The original perpetrator was Max Verstappen, but now Lando Norris is guilty of an infringement. Minimum 10-second penalty for Verstappen for his infringement down the straight. Minimum, because again, there is no mitigating circumstances for Max Verstappen. That is the worst of the two situations, but it's also a 10-second penalty for Lando Norris. Now, we're conditioned with the notion of a lap one, turn one incident. The stewards turn a blind eye to it. No. The stewards deeming things to be a lap one, turn one incident should only apply when there is a high concentration of cars whereby because of the number of cars in such a tight space, drivers have to leave the track to avoid collisions. Now, this isn't a situation where it's a high concentration of cars in a tight space. It's just a one-on-one battle, that is. Max isn't having to avoid anybody else. Lando isn't having to avoid anybody else. That situation would take place under normal racing conditions. We look at these two cars behind. A Ferrari against a McLaren. Do they make it around that corner and both remain on track? Yes, they do. Not a problem there, is there? We look at George Russell on Bortoleto. Has George managed to make it around that with a car on his outside? Yes, he has. Has he left some room on the track? Now, again, he should be leaving a full track width, if we can see, on entry at the braking zone. Where's Bortoleto? Fully alongside. We might have had to track that further back, but again, it's lap one, turn one. They do make some sort of allowances. Let's suggest that Bortoleto's entitled to track room. They go round the corner. George Russell does seem to take a tight line around there. Bortoleto, though, rather than, and again, it's sensible to leave some distance between the two cars. You don't want to get too close and risk a collision. But from this position, rather than even attempt to remain on the track, what does Bortoleto do? He bails out there. Now, does George leave him a car's width? No. Is Charles Leclerc leaving Oscar a car's width? No, he's not. Are they able to make it around the corner with the driver driving on the curb, which is what they sometimes do around racing tracks? Yes. But what does Bortoleto do? Just opts to leave the track. Because George may be aware that that's what he's doing, at this point in time there, Bortoleto clearly looks like he's leaving the track. Does George pick up on that and therefore drift himself closer to the curbing on this side to take a tighter line himself, knowing that he's no longer got to leave that room because the other car has made the choice to leave the track? I don't know. Only George Russell will know that. But Bortoleto does leave the track. And then what we need to look at is what's going on here. We've got three cars, which is Alonso, Hamilton, and Yuki Tsunoda. Before we look at that, we'll bring it back here, because this incident starts back here on the straight. Tsunoda is looking to overtake Bortoleto, and Bortoleto's challenging Alonso there. Bortoleto drifts over to his left. Does he leave a car's width for the car that is trying to challenge him? Well, this is one of those decisions whereby the reality is no. Would the stewards determine that to be okay, reasonable, considering the high density of cars in such a location? This is one of those borderline decisions that they might look at. Reality is, he's not left him a full car's width, but would they give him the benefit of the doubt given the circumstance? What Yuki has done, he has made sure the cars didn't come into contact by moving slightly more to his left, dipping his wheel onto the grass, losing traction, having to lift off, and in doing so making him have to back out of attempting to overtake Bortoleto. In backing off, that then brings Hamilton into play, because you'll see from all that position back, Hamilton's then got extra momentum that Yuki lost through having to back out, and now Hamilton's been able to pull up alongside. Dynamics of the situation as well is, again, Bortoleto is trying to challenge Russell. Alonso is tucked in behind Russell, and his speed around the corner is going to be impacted by all these cars in front of him slowing down. So that makes this gap open for Lewis Hamilton to go into to try and also challenge Alonso, because the space is there and the gap's there. We've now got a situation where going around a corner is 3 cars. Now 3 cars going around a corner side by side is where you get a lap 1, turn 1 incident, a high concentration of cars in a certain area, and to avoid any collisions, some drivers depart the track. You could argue that Hamilton could be closer to Alonso. Yes, you could. But it's a situation whereby you avoid this car, but then in avoiding the car on the inside, you crowd out the car on your outside. It's not just a one-on-one situation, and trying to deal with all of these different dynamics makes it such that often the stewards will look at this and say, okay, this is what we will determine to be a lap 1, turn 1 incident. So as we go around here, Alonso's taken a tight line. Hamilton's stayed wide of Alonso. You could easily argue that Hamilton could be closer to Alonso, but these drivers are giving each other space. Remember, it's the start of a race. They're on a full fuel load. They're driving into a corner. The tyres aren't up to temperature, so they've not got a full grip. Okay, so, and the brakes aren't necessarily warmed up either. They've cooled off a bit while they've been waiting on the grid. So they're a bit tentative going around the first corner, and they're giving each other a bit of room. Meaning that you're giving one car room, you can't afford to give the other car room as well. So Noda's left the track there. And when we play this through, from being behind, well, level with Hamilton, he's rejoined the track. He's actually rejoined the track ahead of Alonso at the point of rejoining, but Alonso soon maintains his momentum and gets ahead, and he rejoins the track ahead of Hamilton. So that would be determined to be a lap 1, turn 1 incident. The infringements there that weren't even looked at by the stewards are Max Verstappen, without any mitigation whatsoever, running Lando Norris off the track in a dangerous bullying manoeuvre. That is a minimum of 10 seconds of a penalty. A worst offence of what Lando then followed it up with. Lando's offence was crowding another car off the track, a dangerous manoeuvre, a 10-second penalty. Mitigation being that he'd been the guy that had just been impacted by Max's dangerous driving. But you're still not going to take away any time from that 10-second penalty, because that doesn't make it right what Lando did. Stewards didn't do a thing. You could argue Bortoleto ran Yuki Tsunoda off the track. Did he leave him a car's width? No. Was he forcing him off the track in the same manner that Antonelli forced Albon off the track, that Ocon forced Stroll off the track, that Max forced Lando off the track? No. But it was still not leaving him a full car's width. So, when being lenient, you could let Bortoleto off with a warning on that situation. But the reality is, by the letter of the law, he did not leave room for the car that was on his outside. But the magnitude of the offence was not to the same degree as the other offences. Perhaps a 5-second penalty would suffice for what Bortoleto did. okay, because he attempted perhaps to leave a car's width, and that was more of a misjudgment because it wasn't quite a car width. So that would perhaps be the way of mitigating the penalty afforded for that level of an infringement. We'll go through the other incidents in the race and see how the stewards ignored them. Now, what you saw in that race was after that first lap, or at the end of the first lap, Verstappen's radio was saying to give back the position. Let's be clear what was going on. Verstappen committed the infringement by crowding Norris aggressively off the track on that start-finish straight going down to turn 1. That was the penalty. Verstappen then remained ahead of Norris by departing the track, but that was the infringement of Norris. So this notion of giving back a position, Max didn't gain a position illegally. He didn't maintain that position illegally through the first corner. He maintained the position illegally by driving the other car off the track. Okay, by going off the track at turn 1, well, he was forced off the track. That wasn't where the infringement was, because it was Lando's infringement there. But what's going on here is the teams are trying to manipulate this to prevent their driver getting penalised. No, your driver has committed an infringement. You've done that. You get a penalty for doing that. Just by switching positions does not mean you don't get a penalty. That is not acceptable. All of the drivers driving in this race, you get a 10-second penalty relative to them. You committed an infringement. You get penalised. It's not about, oh, well, I've just given him the place back, so now we can carry on without you giving me a 10-second penalty that impacts my race by 10 seconds relative to the entire field here. Because that's how penalties work in races. So Max hands the position back. And then a few laps later, we get, we'll fast forward to the footage. Well, actually, just at that very first corner again, at the start of lap 2, let's focus on Fernando Alonso here. Fernando Alonso comes into the corner and he locks up. Okay, we can see that smoke coming off Fernando Alonso's front tyre. He's locked his brakes, coming too hot, and he's locked his brakes. He's locking again, and as such, that's impacted his ability to make it around the chicane. He's then elected to leave the track. Fernando Alonso has driven off the track. He has maintained his position ahead of the car behind by leaving the track. Now, this is the sort of incident whereby Fernando, having maintained that position but left the track, he should concede that position to the car behind him. Just one car behind him, because it's fair to say that the car that's 2 cars behind him, which in this situation is Hamilton, was not in a position to be challenging Fernando and has not actually had anything impacted by what Fernando's just done. But the car behind Bortoleto here may well have been in a position to be challenging Fernando there, due to Fernando making a mistake, but Fernando hasn't lost anything due to his mistake. So if you leave the track and maintain your position, and there is a car in close proximity, such as that, and let's say, for example, the parameter being, when we say close proximity, because let's put a number on this, within a second, within DRS range, okay? If you have a car within a second of you, you make a mistake, you depart the track, then you have to concede the position to the car that is behind you within a second of you. That would be fair. But they don't do that. Anyway, we'll now move to the actual next infringement in the race. Now, I've read in the comment section, that people deem Leclerc's defending against Piastri to be illegal. So let's look at it. Piastri is looking at Leclerc. they're following one another. Leclerc has moved, which would appear to be the normal racing line they're following. Here we've got Verstappen, Leclerc, Piastri behind. They all seem to be following the same kind of line. And Piastri then wants to move to make an overtake around the outside, and Leclerc covers that. Now, what he's done, he's blocked him. Now, that is just about okay. You could argue, and let's just have a look at it there. The nose of Piastri's car is just getting level with Leclerc's rear wheels, but then he sees that the Leclerc is moving to block that space off. That is just about acceptable in terms of defence. Had Oscar got more of his car alongside, then he would have been entitled to be left track room down the outside. But that defending is just about okay from Charles Leclerc. Would be deemed aggressive, but wasn't crowding out room because Oscar hadn't really earned the right to track room because he wasn't really alongside by the time. His car, these things are happening so fast that you have to make a split-second decision. And these split-second decisions aren't always going to be right. What we're doing, we've played this through on replay at quarter speed, whereby we can actually make these determinations. So what you have to bear in mind is this is happening at full speed for these drivers, and they won't get everything right, but the clear infringement is what needs to be punished. And the borderline ones, perhaps you then need to give them the element of the benefit of the doubt, due to them having to make the decisions at such speed. So for that one, I would give Charles Leclerc the benefit of the doubt. Carry on. I'll find the next infringement. This isn't an infringement, but this is a comparison to demonstrate the Carlos Sainz Oliver Bearman incident in the previous video that Bearman got adjudicated as being guilty of. You've got George Russell here in the Mercedes, and on his outside is, I believe, Bortoleto in the kick salver. And we pick them up here, whereby here, there's Russell, and if that's Bortoleto on his outside, which I believe it is, the car on the outside is actually slightly ahead. Now remember, Bearman was on the inside and Sainz was on the outside, slightly ahead. Sainz was slightly more ahead than this at this point. Appears that Bortoleto is the attacking car, trying to do the overtaking manoeuvre around the outside. George Russell's entitled to be there, defending his position. And what's happened is the car on the outside this time has bailed out. But the car on the inside's entitled to be challenging right up to here, isn't he? And the other car on the outside's bailed out, and there's no dramas. That's motor racing. You're allowed to do that. Ollie Bearman was allowed to do what George Russell has just done. But prior to the apex of that corner, at this point there, Carlos Sainz dived across Bearman and collided into him. This is the problem. We got drivers driving like that and not being penalised for it. And people, it's not explained to people what constitutes acceptable driving and what's a penalty. But people should easily be able to understand this. We'll go through to the next infringement. So, having given that place back, Max Verstappen now makes an overtaking manoeuvre on Lando Norris. Head-on view, we're coming down towards that first turn. Lando covers off the inside line, making Max have to come around the outside. Lando will then try to move over to this side of the track as we're looking at it, the right hand side, as they're coming down the straight, it's their left. So Lando, the car on the inside, the defending car that's being overtaken, will try to ensure that he can take a line through here where he sweeps in from as wide as possible so that he can carry the speed through the corner. Max has not got himself fully ahead of Lando so that he can just cut in front of Lando and block him off. He hasn't got himself to that position. So both cars are in contention. They are still contesting this position going into the corner. And as you can see, Max isn't fully clear of Lando. Now, again, we are at a situation whereby these drivers are contesting and they're making split-second decisions. Max isn't fully ahead. They're still contesting, meaning that they have to leave each other track room going around the corner. There has to be a car's width here for Lando, Max on his outside, but having come through the corner, Lando has to ensure that he leaves a car's width on his outside for Max on exit of this corner. What takes place is this. Look at the angle that Max now cuts in at. Lando is forced to take evasive action because of the angle that Max cuts in at. That is not leaving a car's width. Now, we can acknowledge this notion that when going round corners where there is curbing, cars will ride the curbing, so they are not fully on the track. The requirement by the letter of the rules and regulations is that you need to be left a car's width of the tarmac on the track. Max didn't do that. You can see the distance that Max is there. The issue here is the angle that Max cuts in at, making Lando have to deviate his line. Lando is on course. Lando is on course for clipping here. You can see the angle of Lando's car. He's on course for riding this curb. Max cuts in. At that point there, Lando has to apply extra braking force to avoid a collision. He has to steer further to his right to steer out of the way of Max's car, which is converging into his path. That is exactly the same kind of scenario of what Lance Stroll had to do to avoid being hit by Esteban Ocon, what Alex Albon had to do to avoid being hit by Kimi Antonelli, and what Lando himself had to do coming down the straight on lap 1 to avoid being hit by Max. This is the second time in this race that Max Verstappen is guilty of not leaving room on the track for somebody who is contesting position with. He has driven him out of track room, making him have to depart the track. Making him have to. Not a case of, he rode that curb by choice and there was still enough cars for the room for the cars to get round there safely without contacting. No, you have forced the other driver into that action. That is dangerous. There is no mitigating circumstance for that. And here, this is the second time in the race that you've done such a thing. So that's double jeopardy. The penalty is double because it's your second time you've done the same thing. So, if we said the first one was a minimum of 10-second penalty, this one has to be a minimum of 20-second penalty. Max Verstappen. 30 seconds of penalties for the 2 infringements that Max Verstappen is guilty of in this race. The stewards, nothing to see here. Nothing to see. But going round that corner, more than half of Lando's car is made to be off that track due to where Max Verstappen has put his car. That is crowding your fellow competitor off the track. Simple as that. Not even mentioned. They describe that as being a magnificent overtake by Max Verstappen. You can see my other videos where I talk about that. An illegal overtake, absolutely eulogised by the commentary team And yet Oscar does a clean version of that a couple of laps later, and they just describe it as powering around the outside. Whereas Max is this gushing, this incredible overtake. It's disgusting. We've got a car locking up back here. What's going on with that car that's locking up back there? And just leaving the track. Was the car behind it within 1 second as it went through the last timing sector? Will it show us on here? So if Leclerc's just gone through there and Piastri's only 0.6 of a second behind him, he's now left the track and maintained his position. So, again, that should be a situation whereby you've maintained your position having made an error. Now, the other car, if you'd have actually remained on the track, if you'd have made every effort to remain on track, that would have actually slowed your lap time significantly. Okay, had that have been a situation where there were barriers all the way around the track, like Monaco, you'd have actually ended up in the barrier, or you'd have had to slow your car down so much that you would have actually compromised your lap, giving a overtaking opportunity to the car behind you. No, instead you elected to leave the track, maintained your position. This is a situation where the car that's within a second of you should be given that position. You should concede that position. We'll move on to the next infringement. Just to draw your attention to the radio message where Max is ran off the track by Lando at that lap 1, turn 1 incident because Lando left him no room on the outside. Max complains on his radio, he let the brakes go, mate, on purpose, which is exactly what Max Verstappen frequently does. This is what they do. They purposefully crowd the other driver off the track. They drive their car to a position where there is no track room left for their opponent. That is a defensive blocking manoeuvre. But that's an illegal manoeuvre when your opponent has got themselves into a position where they're entitled to be left track room. Max, again, if you forget the fact Max's crime going down to that first corner, on entry to that first corner, Max was entitled to be left room on his outside, on the outside of that corner. Lando didn't do that. Lando either let the brakes go or carried too much speed into the corner. That's an infringement. That's what these drivers do. That's why you need to punish these drivers. Anyway, we move on. And for those of you that have not seen my other video where I go through these manoeuvres in detail, this is a couple of laps later where Oscar's doing the manoeuvre around Charles Leclerc on the outside. Oscar doesn't chop across the line of Charles Leclerc. These drivers make it around this corner, okay, the Ferrari riding the curb, which is what often they'll do, but Oscar staying wide enough of him for the both cars to make it around the corner without an issue. Oscar doesn't chop across the nose of the Ferrari, making Charles Leclerc have to ram his foot on the brake, locking up, and making Charles Leclerc have to steer to his right to take evasive action to avoid a collision due to the fact that Oscar is driving his car into the line that Charles is going to be taking, which is what Max Verstappen did. These cars make it around that corner, and that is acceptable. We move on. Now let's talk through this manoeuvre. This is on board with Isaac Hadjar. We're going down towards turn 1. We are in the braking zone. There's the 50-metre board ahead. Hadjar is attempting to make a manoeuvre on the outside, meaning at the braking zone he has to be fully alongside his fellow competitor in order to be afforded track room. And he's not. Okay? Now, he is attacking this position very, very late. Is he being forced off the track? Well, there's a car's width. Okay? We're deep into the braking zone now, and he's not fully alongside, so he's not entitled to room on exit of this corner. The car that's on the inside has still not run him out of track room. He's still just about on the track. But he's got in so hot that he can't make it around the corner. He's taken to the runoff area. Now you have this array of codes for the bollard, should I say, for the drivers who take this route to have to make it through before they re-emerge on the track. And by doing this negates any advantage of the shortcut of not going through that chicane. So by the time that he then returns to the track at a location whereby he's merging onto the track where all of the other cars can see him and therefore position their car relative to him so that it's safe, and he comes back onto track behind the car that he was previously trying to challenge. And this is essentially the penalty you get because you're now behind him. You're behind him, you've lost time relative to him. So that's the point of having these runoff areas and these measures that you then have to go through as a driver before returning to the track. That's what it does. So that was just to explain that. Now let's have a look at this one. We're riding on board with Fernando Alonso. We're going into the pits. We're closing, we're carrying so much extra speed. We lock up, we go outside the white line. We go onto that red area. Now, is that driving safely? Is that driving under control? We watch it from front on. He's gained all that ground by carrying all that extra momentum. Is he in full control? Is he staying between the white lines? He's locking up, which says you're out of control of your car if you're not fully in control of your car if you've locked your brakes. He's gone outside the white lines. We can go to, which document is it here? Car 44 crossed the white line at pit entry and got a 5-second time penalty for that. The stewards there said the manoeuvre was not considered dangerous in any way. Therefore, the least severe penalty available of 5 seconds is imposed for that. Was there some danger involved in what Fernando did there? Was there a risk? Is he not in full control because he's locked up? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And rather than receive a penalty of either 5 or 10 seconds, because there was some element of danger, he was able to do that and actually gain position by leapfrogging Bortoleto through that pit stop phase. We'll move on. Now let's have a look at this one. This is Liam Lawson attempting a move on the sister team, the Red Bull of Yuki Tsunoda. So they're coming around the bend. We are now going to be coming along the straight on the approach to turn 4 where the chicane is, where we've seen many of these incidents. Drivers naturally coming along here. As we approach, Lawson gets his front tyre, definitely his front wing, partially alongside the Red Bull car, entitling him to be left room along here. He's now alongside. Definitely these front wheels are ahead of the back wheels of Tsunoda's Red Bull. And what's happening now? The Red Bull of Tsunoda is moving across on Lawson. Moving across. There's contact, causing a collision. Now, who has caused a collision? There is a collision. Causing a collision is a 10-second penalty. Who is at fault here? What is going on? So prior to the collision, Yuki Tsunoda is guilty of crowding Lawson off the track. There is not a car's width here. We're going along here. Tsunoda drifts to the right and crowds Lawson. So Tsunoda is guilty of crowding. Now, look at the location of Lawson's car. Tsunoda now is turning into the corner. Look at Lawson's steering wheel. Look at Lawson's tyre of his car just on the track here. Look at his steering wheel. And he turns further in. Lawson is on the outside. He never made it fully alongside. He did get crowded, so the first infringement is Yuki Tsunoda, crowding a fellow competitor off the track, or crowding him on the track, forcing him to have to take evasive action. Now, Yuki is attempting to make the corner, but the car on the outside is turning in too much as well, because the car on the outside has to leave the car on the inside room. If you're going around the outside, you have to leave room. Look at the angle that Lawson's turning in. You're turning in to where he is, and there's a collision. Is there space here for you to be in, Lawson? At the point in time where the collision is there space for you not to be in connecting with his car? Clearly there is. There's all this space on your right hand side, and if you were in this space, this collision would not be taking place. So let's go through this again. Two Red Bull sister team cars. Lawson is fine at this point. Okay, he's on the extremity of the track. Yuki crowds him. That is crowding. That's made him put his wheel onto the mud there. You can see that kicking up some dust. So Yuki is guilty of that. Yuki then turns, but Lawson follows him, and in turning in, causes that collision. That's a 10-second penalty each. 10 seconds to Yuki for crowding, 10 seconds to Lawson for turning in and causing that collision. You've then left the track. You've gained that position and you give that position back. But it's not about just giving that position back in a squabble. You've both committed driving infringements. You should get a penalty for the driving infringement that you've committed, and that impacts your entire race time relative to everybody in that race. It's not just about a squabble between you two that we now say, oh, well, you harmed him and you harmed him back, so let's just cancel it out and leave it at that. No. You've committed a driving infringement, you get a penalty that impacts your race time. And see how that then impacts everybody else in that race. We'll see if there's any more infringements in this race, and then we'll go through how each of these penalties that the drivers should have got impact what then should have been the overall race result. Right, that's all the infringements that I could see that were shown on the Sky Sports F1 highlights on their YouTube channel. So what does imposing those time penalties that should have been awarded to those competitors, how do they impact then the overall race result? So we go down from the top, and let's try and work this through, because I've only just added onto there in this crappy little marking up that I've done what the penalties should have been. Max Verstappen guilty of dangerously crowding Lando Norris off the track on the run down to turn 1 on lap 1. And then, when he made the overtaking manoeuvre, did the same offence, ran Lando Norris off the track, forced Lando to have to brake and deviate his line off the track, crowded him off the track again. The second time you do it, you get double jeopardy, you get a double penalty for that. So if you gave him the minimum penalty for a dangerous manoeuvre on lap 1 of 10, the second offence is double that. So the minimum penalty for Max is 30 seconds. Max won that race by 19.2 seconds. Lando Norris in second place also gets a 10-second penalty for running Max off the track. So you apply the 10 seconds to Lando, and Lando finishes 29 seconds behind Max. But if Max gets a 30-second penalty, then Lando's actually ahead of Max. Does anybody leapfrog the two? Well, Oscar Piastri in third is 21 seconds behind the leader. Oh, so if the leader gets a 30-second penalty, that elevates Oscar up to first position. Oscar wins that Grand Prix. 25 points to Oscar Piastri. Charles Leclerc in fourth position is 25 points off the lead. If the leader gets a 30-second penalty, that drops the leader, Max Verstappen, down to third position. So first position in this race is Oscar Piastri. Second position in this race is Charles Leclerc. Third position is now Lando Norris, because Lando actually goes ahead of Max Verstappen, dropping Max Verstappen down to fourth position. There you go. The top four in this race. Had the stewards applied the appropriate penalties, the top four becomes Oscar Piastri in first, Charles Leclerc in second, Lando Norris in third, Max Verstappen in fourth. The difference to the championship is Oscar gets 25 points as opposed to 15. That's 10 more points for Oscar in the championship. Lando gets 15 points as opposed to 18. That's 3 less. That's a swing of 13 points in the championship. And we're discounting Max at this stage, but we all know that something's going to happen for Max to come back into it and make a miraculous comeback, because that's the way they do these things by design. We come down here. In ninth position is Kimi Antonelli. Now, he got awarded a 5-second penalty for what he did to Alex Albon. That should have been a 10-second penalty. The car behind Kimi was Isaac Hadjar, with an interval of 4.1 seconds behind Kimi. That elevates Hadjar above Kimi, dropping Kimi down to 10th position and elevating Hadjar up to 9th, giving Hadjar an extra World Championship point. Now, what we've also got here is Carlos Sainz in 11th position. Carlos Sainz should have been given 30 seconds worth of penalties at least in that race. Firstly, he disobeyed the race director's instructions when he locked up, left the track at turn 4, did not follow the race director's orders of rejoining the track by keeping to the keeping to the right of the yellow line, which you must keep on your left, and then rejoining that track at the appropriate point for safety and to make sure you've not gained an advantage by cutting off that chicane. He didn't do that. He ignored that. That should result in a 10-second penalty. There was no mitigating circumstances to reduce that to a 5-second penalty. It was a mistake by him. Then, he was the guy that was actually guilty of the collision between him and Behrman. That potentially caused damage to Behrman's car. It was an overtaking attempt that turned out to be an illegal overtaking attempt, which he then got the benefit of. What he also did is cost Behrman a further 8 seconds in his race time, impacting his race. Because Behrman not only lost position to that illegal overtake by Sainz, he lost position to the racing bullet, I think it was Lawson, that also overtook him when he span. That impacted Behrman's race in that manner. It was dangerous. So there's a 20-second penalty for causing a collision and having that level of impact on somebody else's race, in addition to the 10. So there's a 30-second penalty to Carlos Sainz. You add 30 seconds to this gap of 64 seconds that he's recorded as being behind the leader. That puts him to, plus 1 lap. Puts him down into the plus 1 lap sector down here, beyond 15th position. There you go. He's got to be somewhere down here in the beyond 15th position as Carlos Sainz. All these other drivers down here, they are adding extra time. So, relatively speaking, because they don't get World Championship points outside of the top 10, relatively speaking, in terms of the World Championship and the points accumulation, it makes less of a difference down here. But in terms of the driver records and their statistics, it does make a difference. So you actually need to adjust the positions of these cars, and there might be some shuffling around the positions here. Now, Behrman, how is his race impacted? He was recorded as finishing 12th, having been given a 10-second penalty. Firstly, you knock that 10 seconds off Behrman. He was recorded as being 14 seconds behind Sainz. Now, Sainz is out of the way, all right, because Sainz has dropped off down here. So what he is now is 14 seconds. Well, he's 18. Let's say he's 19. He's about 19 and a half seconds behind Hadjar, who's actually been elevated. We're now adding, Takes a bit of working through because what we've had is Antonelli drop down to 10th. So Antonelli is dropped down to 10th, and 11th now is Bearman, with Sainz being demoted, is currently showing as around about 18 seconds behind. You take 10 seconds off of Bearman's time, he's still about 8 seconds behind Antonelli. So ultimately, it doesn't elevate Bearman into the top 10, but it puts him in 11th, 8 seconds behind 10th. This is the impact on races and on the points for the World Championship that these stewards' indecisions have. Those top 10 point scoring positions, well, Antonelli and Hadjar should be reversed. Antonelli should only have 1 point. He got 2. Hadjar should have 2 points. He got 1. Max Verstappen got 25 points. He should be on 12 points for finishing 4th. Lando Norris got 18 points. He should have got 15 points for finishing 3rd. Piastri got 15 points. Should have got 25 points for the win had the appropriate penalties been awarded. And Leclerc in 4th got 12 points. Should have got 18 points for finishing 2nd had the appropriate penalties been awarded by those stewards. If you go through every event and scrutinise all of the infringements and all of the penalties, it is highly likely that you are going to see different points awarded to different drivers at each of those events. That can easily make a difference to those World Championship standings. That brings into question the authenticity of this sport when you can go through the sport, apply what should be the rules and regulations of the sport, simply applied, but not applied because the stewards are incompetent and corrupt and do not apply penalties to certain drivers and yet do penalise others, therefore manipulating these outcomes. That means that we get a manipulated World Championship. This is the shit that we're all watching. This is Formula One. So, I know it's a long-winded video. I know that many people won't watch it. I know that it is too boring for many. But this is the world we live in. Excite the kiddies. Keep selling crack to the kids. And the kids will come to argue for their desires. Create warfare. Make money. Or you can just simply set out the parameters, make sure you educate everybody as to what things need to be, and therefore there should be no arguments. Okay, everybody has a mutual understanding that this is what we're doing, this is why we do this, these are the reasons. If you do this, this is constitutes an infringement, and this is the penalty you get for that. And if everybody understands that and then is held accountable to those standards, then there should be no argument, because there is the evidence to say, well, these are the standards, these are the parameters, and this is how you breached that, and therefore this is the penalty. It's not a debate, it's not a discussion. This is the clear explanation of why it is that now you have been penalised in that manner. Like I say, there are the occasions where there are some things which can be considered borderline. This does take place at high speed. Everything that we're doing now is scrutinising this in slow motion. When the drivers have to make those snapshot decisions in real time, then you sometimes will have to give them the benefit of the doubt. But more often than not, there are clear-cut decisions that can be made by those stewards, and they fail to make those decisions, or they get the decisions wrong, or they fail to apply the appropriate penalty. And that is not due to incompetence. That is due to corruption. Incompetence should not be tolerated. This is supposed to be the pinnacle of the sport. Therefore, it is your responsibility as the people that are organising the pinnacle of the sport to make sure that you employ the right people in the right roles with the required skills to perform those roles. It is your requirement, your duty to do so. If you fail in that duty, you are not fit to be the governing body of this sport. You are not fit to administer this sport. and the stewards that you select are not fit to steward this sport. This is the FIA, a corrupt governing body that is not fit for purpose, that manipulates outcomes through the manipulation of the decisions that it makes. That's the end of this video. Thank you for your time.